Okay, good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for being with us today, and welcome to this seminar, which is hosted by the Just to See project. The Just to See project is an Horizon 2020 project. Just to See is an acronym which stands for a just transition towards a circular economy. It is a project which is investigating the suitability of the circular economy paradigm and possibility of implementing it in a variety of scenarios, both in the global north and in the global south, with a specific emphasis on the social dimension of the transition. It is our pleasure to have here with us Professor Benjamin Selwyn, who is a professor of international relations and international development at the University of Sussex. Prof. Selwyn is an author of 3 single-author books and several journal papers that shaped the debate on global supply chains and their role in contemporary economies. And today's talk is very relevant to what we are doing within the Just to See project. As within this project, we are really investigating the role of global supply chains, the contradictions they expose, and the problems which are inherent to this way in which global production is organized. And as the COVID-19 pandemic expanded across the world in early 2020, we witnessed the first global supply chain crisis. Global supply chains nowadays represent really the epitome of the structure of contemporary global capitalism. And we have understood that any disruption to them can potentially threaten the functioning of the whole economic system. In this talk that Prof. Selwyn will be delivering today, we will go essentially through a recent piece of his, which has appeared in the monthly review. In his piece, Ben argues that while the resilience agenda seeks to revive global supply chains, it is in fact contributing to policies that are hastening the concentration and centralization of capital and increasing geopolitical dimensions of capitalist competition. Far from contributing to a more stable global political economy for the economic benefit of all, the supply chain resilience agenda represents an attempt to reassert the power of monopoly capital in core economies over subordinate capitals, peripheral and semi-peripheral states, and above all, over labor. And we found this piece that Ben authored very significant, also because in our discipline, I am a supply chain management scholar, there is a sort of unquestioned fate, as my colleague Akis would say, in the role of global supply chains. As supply chain management scholars, we seldom understand that global supply chains were born 50 years ago or so to support a new wave of capitalist restructuring and essentially to start a struggle against the labor movement in the Western world. So without wasting further time from my side, I give the floor to Ben for his discussion of the paper. And then I'm sure that a very interesting and stimulate debate will follow. You can write questions in chat, or also raise your hand at the end of Ben's presentation in such a way that we can hear your questions. Over to you, Ben.
Thanks very much, Andrea. Lovely introduction, very generous of you. And thanks so much for inviting me. I've been to Sheffield a few times. I know I'm not there now, but it's a great place to be, both the city and the university. And I can see that what you're doing, your project, is very absolutely relevant. So thanks again. So to get started, basically, if we cast our minds back to the COVID pandemic in the first few months, there were all kinds of dire warnings. The IMF was talking about a collapse on a par or greater than the 1929 collapse. People started saying this is a first global supply chain crisis, and the resilience agenda in global value chains, global supply chains really proliferated after that. Just a note, I think as far as I understand, the resilience agenda started after 2008 crisis, but it really became much more central to kind of central mainstream GVC analysis after the COVID crisis. And most of the research starts with the assumption, hence no need to explain, the assumption that we need to shore up global value chains, global supply chains. They assume that they're developing positive and that any disruption to them would be an absolute disaster. Funny though, that they're working quite well now, and now we have this massive inflationary crisis. Just put that moment aside. Anyway, the mainstream, as Andrea mentioned in your introduction, the mainstream conception of supply chains is simply of the production and distribution of components and final consumption. Very little analysis of who gains from them. Then you have the more sophisticated, I would say, global value chain approach associated with Gary Gareffi and tons of other people, which does attempt to actually conceptualize how value is divided and allocated within global value chains. But both of them, the global supply chain and the global value chain approach, assume win-win positions. Now, what I'm going to argue today is that this agenda, the resilience agenda, hides ideologically the exploitative nature of global value chains. It hides and actually cloaks the geopolitical agenda behind much of this approach, the resilience agenda. And whilst I'm guessing you would expect politicians and people like that to make all kinds of unfounded claims about the primacy of the US and the bad behavior of China and so on, you've actually got lots of academics doing the same thing, which is surprising, to say the least. I would actually want to argue further that the resilience agenda reveals the true nature of global supply chains. That is, that they are an imperial organized class relations, massive capital concentration, and severely anti-labor. Just on a separate note, I have written a couple of papers on global poverty chains, and I define them as places where workers work in global value chains when they earn below a living wage and they work more than 48 hours a week. A very basic conception of a living wage. My argument is that the resilience agenda will deepen these poverty chains and create more poverty chains. Key argument about my talk to be summarized like this: the resilience agenda is much less about the risks of a breakdown of global supply chains and much more about reasserting the power of lead firms, but especially US lead firms and the US state within the geopolitical structure of global value chains. Now, that latter point about the role of the US state might surprise some people, not because we don't think about it, but because the literature is relatively blind to it. Now, there is a belated recognition within the GVC community that states are important. You know, you get that thing in social science, let's bring the state back in. Well, why was it ever excluded in the first place? That reflects the poverty of so much social science. But, you know, we're forced down into this division of labor where we take these little minute slices out of social life and study them intensely whilst forgetting about the others. But the point is the role of the states in general, but especially the United States in establishing value chain capitalism, as I call it, is very important. From the role of the military industrial complex in establishing things like various forms of technology, computers, the internet, the role of the US state in pushing forward the resolution to the debt crisis in the early 80s through structural adjustment programs, the Baker Plan, the empowerment of lead firms through TRIPS, trade-related intellectual property rights, which again was very much pushed by the United States governments, especially Clinton, and of course the role of the Chinese state in establishing the export processing zones and then broader production zones across China to produce much of the firstly cheap and then more high-tech goods over time. Now the states and the US state have played this major role in the historical development of value chain capitalism. And we are now entering, I would argue, a new phase in the role of states, and that is an explicitly geopolitical phase where the US is doing many things, including using the resilience agenda to try and corner and put China back in its box. Because it's not that China is threatening the US power, it's just that it's developing a little bit too much for US strategists, and it represents a threat in maybe 20 to 50 years' time, which the US is responding to now. So, all this talk about Biden being different to Trump and the previous Obama pivot to Asia, George W. Bush, full spectrum dominance, that is all part of the same trajectory there. Now, before I go into the analysis of the resilience agenda, I just wanted to recap on the issues of GVC, GSP analysis. Now, the World Bank produced this quite remarkable document in 2020, the World Development Report, which it produces every year since 1978, always uses comparative advantage to show how there are win-win development possibilities emerging from these from international trade. And this report was on global value chains, trading for development in the age of global value chains. And the headline claim was GVCs boost incomes, create better jobs, and reduce poverty. Angel Gurria, the former head of the OECD, says everyone can benefit from global value chains. Encouraging the development of and participation in GVCs is the road to more jobs, more sustainable growth for our economies. Gary Gareffi, the master thinker in mainstream GVC, says development requires linking up with the most significant lead firm in the industry. And they justify this through a range of intellectual steps. One is hyper-specialization, the extrapolation from Adam Smith's pin factory in one part of Scotland to global specialization. Another part is through transaction cost economics, where relationships between firms are eased by the transfer of information and the benign role, they say, of the lead firms. Now, the reason this is a remarkable document, the World Bank Development Report, is because it contradicts itself. It provides evidence within its pages that contradict its headline claim. In fact, it shows often that GVCs concentrate wealth, repress incomes, create many bad jobs, and reproduce new forms of in-work poverty. It shows that. Now, we on the left often get accused of creating straw men or straw people of the people we're arguing against. But in this case, at least, we can't be accused of that. So I'll just read some quotes. These are quotes from the World Development Report. So on GVCs and falling wages, this is a quote, global value chains have contributed to lower inflation via downward pressure on labor through heightened competition across countries to attract tasks, in particular when low-wage countries are integrated into supply chains. Downward pressure on labor. Augmentation of lead firm power. Quote, large corporations that outsource parts and tasks to developing countries have seen rising markups and profits, suggesting that a growing share of cost reductions from GVC participation are not being passed on to consumers. At the same time, markups for producers in developing countries are declining. Shift in value added from labor to capital. Quote, in 63 developed and developing economies, GVC integration, as well as other domestic with-industry forces such as technology or markups, contributed significantly to the reallocation of value added from labor to capital between 1995 and 2011. Now, why is there such a discrepancy between their headline claim and this evidence? Well, maybe the World Bank is just a propagandist for capital. But more deeply than that, I mean, I don't think the authors think of the report. These are intelligent people. They're top university professors. You know, they would not say, I'm a propagandist for capital. What they would say, though, are that global supply chains are technical structures through which the division of labour can be expanded. And as Smith said, with the expansion of division of labour, expansion of specialisation, rising productivity, everyone gains and the wealth of nations is increased. But the point I want to make is that GVCs and GSPs are certainly not technical structures by any stretch of the imagination. These are sets of social relations in general, and specifically, global value chains represent a class project of big capital, the lead firms, to widen the sphere of exploitation of labour and to capture as much surplus value as possible. That's value capture. The essence of capital accumulation is the augmentation of the power of capital and the reproduction of a propertyless, often poor, labouring class. And those quotes that I read out from the WDR, from the World Development Report, I think highlight that element about capital accumulation, about Marxist conception of capital accumulation. That is more of a reality than their conception of the benign effects of the division of labour. Now, that's just the background. What about the resilience agenda? Now, the logic of supply chains is that through outsourcing, through just-in-time production, you, as a lead firm, generate huge productive efficiencies. You cut costs of production, you cut costs of storage, you ensure the most efficient forms of production possible. And for decades, since the 70s, but especially since 1991, this system has been very good in making huge profits for the lead firms, many of which now are bigger than national economies. And as an aside, if a national economy behaved like a lead firm, you'd call it a dictatorship, because they have no rights. They have no democratic rights for their workers. The workers' right is to walk away. They don't have a right to structure how the firm works. But that's an aside point. The problem, though, of the just-in-time production and hyper-specialization is that you get these bullwhip effects, in that you have small disruptions in one part of the chain can create massive disruptions elsewhere in the chain. So, for example, Peter Hassenkamp, who is a former director of Tesla's supply chain strategy, noted it takes 2,500 parts to build a car, but only one not to. So the COVID crisis did threaten, for a moment, it looked like it threatened this strategy of just-in-time production and hyper-specialization, especially when that ship got caught in the Suez Canal. Suddenly, the world's imagination was captured by this image, and a lot of intellectual effort went into promoting resilience in supply chains. It has also been promoted in response to China's rise and the realization that certain strategic resources are produced in a few countries. So how do we move from a situation of many supply chains which are potentially at risk of disruption? And these are disruptions of things like COVID, but increasingly of climate breakdown. Interestingly, if you do a search on Google for global supply chains climate breakdown, 95% or most of it will tell you that, oh, isn't it terrible? Global supply chains, global value chains are threatened by climate breakdown. They won't tell you that global value chains threaten more and more intense climate breakdown. So how do you establish supply chain resilience? The literature out there takes its cue from the notion of upgrading, where firms become more competitive by adopting new strategies, new products, sourcing from new regions, reorganizing production. And the supply chain resilience strategy represents a new phase, you could say, of upgrading, in which firms are encouraged to adopt a number of strategies. These would include, for example, producing new products which are easier to replace and easier to replace standardized products, and the establishment of buffer stocks. So a shift a little bit back to the old Fordist mode of business. New forms of chain governance that involve more risk analysis of both places where production is taking place and of suppliers. Resilience monitoring through assessing recovery time required by suppliers in response to shocks in the chain. Reshoring or nearshoring production. You'll remember that during his presidency, Donald Trump celebrated very much the move of Foxconn to Wisconsin, saying, look, this is Make America Great Again in action. In reality, Foxconn did not deliver that big move, which suggests quite a lot of things. But when you think about supply chain mapping, you've got a range of things which I'll come back to in a second. You've got new technologies necessary. You've even got now the latest phrase, which is from someone in the World Bank or IMF, talking about friend shoring. It's incredible how they feel that they have to dumb down their language for popular consumption. But I read recently the recent DHL report on globalization, and they do a very good job, I think. I mean, it's DHL, so you may think, it's not really academic, but it's produced by academics in the Stern Business School in New York. And people like Danny Roderick endorse it. So it has got some genuine value. And one of the tables they have in there is quite impressive. It shows that even since COVID, the distance traveled by commodities has increased since COVID. So rather than this contraction that everyone's talking about of reshoring, friendshoring, whatever, actually you've got renewed globalization. As anyone schooled in critical political economy will tell you, of course, globalization is not always the same. It's always uneven and always shifting. But the fact is, it's still expanding there. Now, what about the supply chain resilience agenda? What is hidden about it? Because all of that stuff I said about new products, supply chain mapping, etc., risk analysis, that all sounds kind of benign enough. That sounds like the kind of material that you could present to a mainstream business conference on supply chain management, saying, guys, this is what you need to do this, and you'll have a more resilient supply chain. And people will say, yeah, that's what I need to do, right? What is it hiding? What is it missing? First of all, the supply chain resilience agenda is missing the fact that supply chains were made more resilient during the COVID pandemic through massive class struggle from above. That is, placing huge increased pressure upon workers by capital through falling wages, wage theft, worsening conditions, more dangerous conditions. So, for example, workers were pushed, and Trump signed a law forcing workers in places like Tyson, meat processing plants to keep working. And the managers, they had bets on how many workers would get sick from COVID and even die. You've had the intensification of the dormitory labor regime in Foxconn, where it's most famous, but elsewhere across Asia. In the article that Andrea mentioned, my critique of supply chain resilience, I give an example of how in Vietnam, in order to contain the spread of the COVID virus, workers were basically locked into their factories. They slept by their machines. This is like dormitory regime plus. Dormitory regime, they're actually next to the factories, but they're outside. In this situation, they're in the factory. They're sleeping in the factories. In the article, I also point out how there's a lot of wage theft. The Clean Clothes campaign has done a very good job in documenting very high levels of wage theft across places, especially like Bangladesh, where there is large-scale garment production, Workers who are either laid off without pay or they're forced to work longer hours without extra pay. So there's wage theft there. There's also examples of forced labour, and this has been picked up by many people. Alex Hughes in Newcastle has written about this. The British Medical Journal has written about this. Even the American state, one of its departments, has written about this. So, for example, a large amount of protective personal equipment was being produced in China, made by forced North Korean labour, unpaid, effectively coerced labour from North Korea. So what you have in these cases, and what is never picked up in the resilience agenda and literature, is that supply chains can be made more resilient by exploiting workers more. There is also another element, like I mentioned in the discussion about the supply chain resilience agenda and how it's being promoted. So one of the examples would be through new products which make production more effective. And there's a lot of discussion about, you can have reshoring and you can have smart factories and you can have new high tech. And this is very interesting. In fact, this is itself leading to problems in supply chains, which I'll come on to in a second. But the point is, let's reshore, let's have smart factories, let's use new technology to do so. And that all, again, sounds good, doesn't it? More efficient production. But if you look at Amazon, for example, on Staten Island, where they recently had a union recognition after a long fight, Amazon has introduced this new robot called Chuck. And this robot forces workers to run behind it. It dictates almost completely, or much more than previously, the rate of the labor process. So let me just quote here from Financial Times columnist who writes about labour. She says, in a survey of 145 workers at an automated Amazon warehouse on Staten Island, 60% experienced physical pain while working in the shoulders, hands, back, ankles, knees, and 42% continued to experience pain outside work. Humans are being crunched into a robot system working at a robot pace. Or to put it in more kind of Marxist terminology, there's a greater subordination of living labour, humans, workers, to dead labour, that is machinery. That has always been a tendency under capitalism historically, but under this new form of smart factories where AI is being implemented, that level has taken up to a new height. What about other ways of increasing the use of technology to manipulate labour? Surveillance. We've all heard about Shoshana Zuboff's book, Surveillance Capitalism. But we've seen how under the COVID situation, more and more workers worked from home, especially white collar workers. And they've been subject increasingly to what is called algorithmic management. That is continuous tracking of workers' performance, automated decision-making about tasks, and evaluation of client feedback. So in those examples of the use of new technology, we can see that this new technology is used to surveil and increase the rate of exploitation of labour, without labour's consent, obviously. Now, another ingredient of supply chain resilience is that of supply chain mapping. And this is the logic that if you know how and where your suppliers are, how they operate, so on, you'll be ready for the next shock. One example of this was how Volkswagen tried to map its supply chain, and it took about a year to do so. Now, this is a massive company with huge resources. So the point about supply chain risk analysis and supply chain mapping is far from representing a strategy for all managers in supply chains, for all supply chain capitalists or owners. It represents a strategy that's purely available and possible for very well-financed supply chain lead firms. So what that really means is that some lead firms will be able to increase their knowledge of and power over supply firms even more than has already been the case. I mean, there are all kinds of cases previously about lead firms forcing supplier firms or requiring supplier firms to open their books to give information to the lead firms about where materials come from, how much they cost, how much it costs to produce them, and so on, so that the lead firms can really understand exactly the input-output process as they would see it. But that really is the surveillance of the capital-labor relation in supplier firms, in nominally independent supplier firms. Okay, so all of that is hidden in the supply chain resilience agenda. But the thing that is really obscured in that agenda is the geopolitical element, or at least half of it is obscured, because the geopolitical element is seen as a problem caused by China to be solved by the United States. So, for example, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, the White House published its report, Building Resilient Supply Chains, Revitalizing American Manufacturing and Fostering Broad-Based Growth. So in a Biden speech, he says, before the publication of this document, he says, the United States needs resilient, diverse, and secure supply chains to ensure our economic prosperity and national security. Resilient American supply chains will revitalize and rebuild domestic manufacturing capacity, maintain America's competitive edge in research and development, and create well-paying jobs. They will also support small businesses, promote prosperity, advance the fight against climate change, and encourage economic growth in communities of color and economically distressed areas. Well, he certainly gets an A for propaganda effect. What this really means, though, is when you zoom in to the actual report, it notes, for example, I mean, it mentions China hundreds of times in that report. But here's one quote from the report. China was estimated to control 55% of global rare earth mining capacity in 2020 and 85% of rare earth refining. The US must secure reliable and sustainable supplies of critical minerals and metals to ensure resilience across US manufacturing and defense needs. Now, given what I said previously, right at the beginning, about the continuity between Biden, going backwards, Biden, Trump, Obama, George W. Bush, and I should just say here, in case anyone misrepresents me, I was so pleased when Biden won. Thank God for that. I don't believe in God, but I said that. Trump is the lowest of the low. So I'm not drawing equivalence there, but I'm saying in terms of the imperial geopolitical agenda, there is continuity there. Now, you would expect that from politicians, unfortunately, but what you don't expect is that academics buy into this, or maybe you do. But here is a piece from the Californian Journal of Management, I think it is, by Panwa, Pinsk, and Dimarchi, writing about the White House report. And they mention that how the report raises concerns about, and I quote, aggressive industrial development policies of other countries, especially China. Now, if you know anything about the really existing historical capitalism, you will know that all countries that have developed have deployed industrial policy. You will know that the US was described by Paul Byrock as the mother country of protectionism. So to say that it's China's fault because it's aggressive policy, to me, seems like either ignorance, which can't be because they're academics, or xenophobia, which of course they'd deny. I'm not xenophobic. Well, what are you? Now, this is where it kind of comes back into a bit of a loop, because much of the supply chain resilience agenda was driven by a fear of the concentration of computer chips, especially semiconductors, in Taiwan, and China's increasing dominance over the production of components into them, and of obviously its proximity to Taiwan. It's well, as the US would say, its objectives of re-embracing Taiwan, right? Even though Xi Jinping says that's not his objective. So the idea was that the problem there was that resilience was needed because there was a drying up in supply of semiconductors. But in Chip Wars, Chris Miller provides a very interesting bit of data. He says, in 2021, more semiconductors were produced than ever before, 1.1 trillion of them. It was not a question of the supply side, i.e. the whole scenario, the whole fear-mongering about this one location not being able to produce the world's needs of supply chain semiconductors was overblown. Rather, it was a demand side problem, in that many of those firms engaging in new smart technologies, which is part of the resilience agenda, they were demanding and buying up semiconductors for their operations, for their AI, and they were creating a spike in demand. So you see how the resilience agenda itself generates geopolitical pressures, generates concentrating pressures, and is used in geopolitical ways. Now, the resilience agenda, I argue in that paper, is very much about, or at least the way it's being used by the United States state, is about keeping China a semi-peripheral country. Now, China, in this notion, is engaged in exploitative relations with parts of the world in other parts of Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, but it channels huge amounts of surplus value to the United States. You must be aware of that famous figure of the Apple iPhone, 58% of which the cost of it, or the price of it, is Apple profits, and 1.8% is Chinese workers' wages. So that is the context. And to quote or to refer to John Mearsheimer, he says that the US strategy is very much about technological containment of China and even technological rollback. When you look at go back to TRIPS, the trade-related intellectual property rights agenda under the WTO, you can see that this agenda extended copyrights, patents, intellectual property of especially US firms like Apple well into the future, enabling them to generate and gain monopoly rents for a very long time, much more than any normal kind of capitalist competition would allow. Similarly, in this situation, what you have is the US state using the resilience agenda to try and box in China and to contain, or at least constrain, its development, not to knock it out, but to maintain it as it was originally intended, which was as a supplier of cheap wage goods and intermediate components, which would make some profits for the Chinese emergent ruling classes and capitalist cadre classes, but fundamentally would continue to bolster US firms' competitiveness rather than compete with them. And as Mearsheimer and others say, this agenda is about constraining it, keeping it in its box. Okay, so just to sum up, the resilience agenda, I think, is like the GVC agenda, is one of basic propaganda, where everyone benefits from global supply chains. The World Bank Development Report shows that not to be true, and the resilience agenda, I think, shows that not to be true as well. The resilience agenda reveals the geopolitical elements and determinations of supply chain capitalism or value chain capitalism. From the beginning, there's been a strong geopolitical element, and that continues today. It reveals the nature of value chain capitalism, which is to attempt to continually increase the exploitation of labor in as many ways as possible. And that labor is not just in the global south or the periphery, it's right in the core. Of course, though, I mean, those Tyson workers often are maybe immigrant workers subject to kind of various constraints on their legal rights and so on. So I would argue that the resilience agenda is far less about the potential dangers of the breakdown of the supply chain system and much more about reasserting the power of big lead firms and reasserting the power of the United States, which it is worried that it's losing. And I'll leave it there. Thanks very much, Andrea.
Thank you, Ben, for your fascinating talk. And we have already a few questions from our audience. I think there is Tommaso who wrote a question in the chat. Tommaso, do you want to read it and maybe to expand on it? Are you still here with us? Tommaso,
yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
sure.
please. Yeah.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for your talk. It was really fascinating. My question is about the concept of supply chain integration I'm using in my research, also with my research team. So looking at your main argument, we could even say that when the lead firm is trying to integrate with its suppliers and customers, map the supply chain, try to exchange more information, reach just in time, is a sort of dictatorial mechanism, maybe. Also because, you know, the information is not really shared. There is one actor in the supply chain which has access to it, while the others probably don't.
Thanks, Thomas. Ben.
So within the GVC mainstream, I mean, there's a classic article by Humphrey Sturgeon, Garefi, Humphrey and Sturgeon from 2005, and that has set the agenda in many ways for much of the subsequent GVC analysis. And that argues that this form of integration that you've described there, Tommaso, of subordinate integration by supply firms or by lead firms of supply firms is not a result of monopoly power of capital and not exploitative, but is a function of transaction cost economics, or at least can be explained through transaction cost economics, in that the argument is in transaction cost economics that when you're trading on an open market, you or I could sell each other stuff, but we don't know if we're being honest, or maybe we make a mistake or something like that, or maybe we lose stuff on the way. You know, I sell you something, sell you 6 eggs, one of them breaks before it gets to you, or something like that. But obviously, if you have control over that situation, if you can govern that chain, you can reduce the transaction costs. You can reduce the possibilities of lying, deceit, mistakes. You know, it's not always malicious. You can reduce that, and consequently and happily, you can increase the efficiency of transactions in supply chains. And so from then onwards, the mainstream agenda within GVC and global supply chain analysis has seen this kind of integration under lead firm power in benign terms. They see lead firms doing everyone a favor. They see lead firms doing supplier firms a favor. They see them doing us a favor as consumers, and so on. They see them doing workers a favor, because through increased efficiency, you have increased output, specialization, etc., increased employment. Win, win, win. They can't get enough of the win-win situation. But if you turn it around and look at it from a different, more critical perspective, you do see, I think, that the governance of supply chains is not only about reducing transaction costs. I accept that. I think it can be part of that. But more fundamentally, the reason they want to do that is because they want to increase their so-called value capture, which in the way I think is about surplus value capture, transferring surplus value that's produced in supply firms to the lead firms. And supply chain governance provides a wonderful way of doing that, because you can basically set prices. And as Hayek himself said in The Road to Serfdom, the minute you get that situation of market being determined by power relations, all of the market mechanisms that we, the neoliberals, or whoever he was in that sense at that moment, everything we say about markets functioning well for the benefit of all disappears. and you're moving into a different form of relationship between firms. And that's exactly what I think has happened. And the data in the World Development Report seems to indicate that. Rising markups for lead firms, falling markups for supply firms. How else can you explain that? As on aggregate, you know?
Thank you very much, Ben, for this answer, for the reference to Hayek as well. But this also links, to some of my early readings. I mean, I remember, 25 years ago or so, reading something from Ernest Mandel, was describing, the early supply chains working in a way which essentially function outside of the market conceptualization, because as you were saying, you have the lead firm setting up prices, and so the price signals stop working. You have one dominant player which is orchestrating, coordinating the resources, which has then the ability of escaping from the laws of demand and supply. Would you agree with this perspective?
Kind of. On one hand, yes. It depends who you're reading Mandel in relation to. If you're reading him in relation to the ideological mainstream, who take often an untheorized notion derived from kind of neoclassical economics about markets and about the benefits of markets and so on, then yes, what you've just described, Andrea, I think is spot on, very accurate, and quite before his time in many ways. Mandel was a great scholar, and not just scholar, but political actor in his own right. On the other hand, I would qualify that slightly by saying, you said how Mandel says that when you get this, you move away from the real, you start functioning outside of the market. My understanding of monopolies and capitalism is derived from Marx, in the sense that he's got this amazing quote in The Poverty of Philosophy. And to paraphrase him badly, he says, competitions create monopoly, monopoly creates competition. So from Marx's very early perspective, I don't know how old he was when he wrote that, probably in his mid-20s or something, embarrassingly young. But he saw how monopolies and competition were dialectically related, and so there was no normal functioning of the market. The market, in inverted commas, gives rise to monopolies. It exacerbates competition, which then creates new monopolies. So I see monopolies in that sense as a moment in the process of capitalist competition. So I'd agree with you, depending on who we're talking.
Yeah, I think this resonates very much also with Paul Sweezy's characterization. Another question that I wanted to ask you, and then I'm sorry, I'll leave the floor to other people, but can't resist this one now. I mean, what we have been describing, the way in which these main firms orchestrate resources, access raw materials, plan the production, plan the distribution, couldn't be interpreted also as an argument in favor of planning. Aren't global supply chains and the way in which these giant organizations, which, as you said, sometimes, have a bigger size in terms of revenues of nation states, and they creating the conditions for a planned economy. I think you're familiar with this great book from Leigh Phillips and Mikhail Razovsky about People's Republic of Walmart, where they say, well, with the coordination, orchestration capacity they have, the computing power, they're showing us that another economy could be possible. And if, this planning ability would be put at the service of the majority of the population, we could transition to a planned economy, in essence. What's your thought on this?
No, while you're saying that, and before you mentioned the name of that book, I was looking around my very messy desk to try and find it, because I was going to show it to you, say, yes, exactly, that's what they're saying, but you said that. So yeah, that book is fantastic. It's got so many great examples, and I totally agree with its arguments. It's not a question of for or against planning. It's a question of democratic or despotic planning, to put it as simply as possible. And what we have is increasingly despotic planning. Marx has, again, he says that the laws of kind of capitalist competition, competitive capital accumulation, combine despotism with anarchy. So the anarchy of the market translates itself into each firm trying to outcompete the other through despotic control of labor, so through the labor regime, through the labor process. And global value chains lead firms are trying to overcome that anarchy to an extent by this planning. The only problem is that planning is undemocratic and tailored towards profit maximization and accumulation rather than human need. But so the argument there, I totally agree with you, Andrea. But the question is, how do we get there? Which is what is to be done question. Yeah.
Thank you, Ben. I think we have Jose, please, and then Akis.
No, Akis was first.
Okay, Akis, please go.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you, Professor, for your great talk. In your opinion, is the war in Ukraine also a confrontation among competing global value chains? And what is the most probable scenario you foresee, especially in the context of the power balance between the West, that would be the US, and the East, let's say China, for instance?
So I think that's a great question. So stepping back from this idea of dangerous industrial policies that these academics point the finger at China for pursuing, I think it's quite obvious. I mean, if you look at the European Green Deal, which is really designed to shovel tons of cash and strategic capacity to some big firms, all countries are pursuing industrial policies. That is now, 10 years ago, you'd have had to do a bit of work to make that argument, but now it's kind of pretty mainstream. It's only here in Brexit Britain that people say, "Oh, we don't need industrial policies, we're so great," but everyone does it. So industrial policy is a fact. They're not just picking winners; they're supporting already big firms, and this does have geopolitical consequences. For example, over questions of rare earths and things like that, about control over resources. So I don't think you can ever separate the supply chain from its geopolitical context. So there's always the force of the state behind that. And Friedrich List talked about industrial policy, and did a very good critique of the Adam Smith Ricardo version of free trade, saying, look, if you're backward, they used those phrases in those days. If you're backward compared to these more advanced countries, you're going to remain backward. You need to have industrial policy to upgrade, to import language from now to then. And then Marx critiqued List, and Hilferding added to that critique, saying, Germany start using that policy to upgrade your national economy. Well, others will start using that in response to you, and that will lead and that will generate these kind of geopolitical tensions. And they were writing well before the First World War. So I think there is this rising kind of geopolitical pressure, which is exacerbated with all kinds of actions. Biden outlawing export of kind of high-tech goods to China, stuff like that. That will fan the flames. But then, if you just leave it up to the market, then you'll have other dynamics which will also create problems. There's no kind of this golden arches theory of peace and this idea of the benign kind of capitalist trade generating kind of Kantian peace, what have you. I mean, that doesn't speak to me. At certain moments it looks like that, but underneath those moments there are shifting tectonic plates of capital concentration, some monopolies falling, others rising, which then generate geopolitical tension. So yes, so to basically put it in the longer view, I think for me, value chain capitalism really emerges, it gestates from the 1970s with the new International Division of Labour, analysed by Frobel, but it really kind of flowers or becomes globally kind of pretty predominant after 1991. And for that period from 1991 to 2008 especially, it did seem like the golden arches of peace theory, Kantian liberal peace theory, etc., was somehow implicated and generated by this growing integration. But I think the recent period since 2008, but especially since COVID, is creating more of these geopolitical tensions. So I think value chains, supply chains are more and more integrated with these geopolitical tensions. Yeah.
Thank you, Jose.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you very much for the talk, Professor Benjamin. And my question is a bit more of a bit of a clarification on your argument and your take, because from what I understand, you're arguing that the resilience, this political narrative about resilience, has a geopolitical dimension on the one hand, and also a surplus value extraction dimension. And I wanted to understand a bit your view about how the relationship between these two, if one is being driven by the other, or they are both taking advantage of the problems in global value chains created by the COVID-19. Or is it one a political justification for the other? Is it the geopolitical argument a way to sell what lead firms are doing, want to do with this mapping of supply chains and grabbing more control of it, or the opposite? I wanted to understand a bit more your take on the relationship between these two areas that the supply chain resiliency are affecting and are being executed through.
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and to be honest, I have not figured out exactly the relationship. You asked me, is surplus value extraction and driving geopolitics, or vice versa? And I haven't thought about it in that way, and I think that's a great question. And you can definitely work on that and find interesting. If you set that up as a kind of question, you could find interesting results and worthwhile analysis. But if we go back to Karl Polanyi, he made this great statement in The Great Transformation. He says, the road to and continual operation of the free market was driven by the establishment and continued and increased intervention by the central state. Okay, so he was making that point against this fallacy of freestanding, free-floating markets. And so I just made that point to highlight the fact that you can never really separate geopolitics from the economy, as it were, the economy. But that said, like Ellen Wood made that point about the separation of the economic and the political, under capitalism, you do have this institutional separation between the economy and the public sphere and geopolitics. So economic transactions, especially within the EU, not so much in the UK anymore, but economic transactions can take place relatively independent or completely independent, really, or seemingly independently of geopolitics, politics, states, and so on. So in that sense, there is a relative autonomy of geopolitics on the one hand and surplus grabbing, surplus extraction, enhancing techniques on the other. So I would say that there's this relative autonomy of the two, and I wouldn't say that one drives the other. But if you want to find a cause, the deep causal relationship or the deep causal driver, it's the age-old thing of competitive capital accumulation and how that kind of not fragments, how that works through all of these relations. So basically, I mean, I wouldn't be able, I don't think I can say concretely which one is which leads to the other in that sense. But I would say that the US state is using this to its advantage. Others are using it to their advantage. Donald Trump is using it to his advantage. I would say that lead firms are using it to their advantage in terms of accumulation strategies, in terms of new technologies, AI, digital technologies, and so on. And I would say that these things are very closely related, although nominally and relatively distinct. So I'd say I'd resort to the old Marxist trick of saying it's dialectical. They both relate to each other. I mean, you know, it's true. I think it's dialectical, but at the same time, I do recognize that when people say that it's dialectical, it's almost like a kind of get out clause. I don't know what you think, Jose. What's your take on it?
Oh, yeah. I think two things are very much related as you, and I think it's very hard to disentangle one driving the other or not, but I wanted to hear you about how they relate to one another, and or maybe they're just taking opportunity and advantage from the shocks. This happened, the COVID pandemic has happened, created a new environment. There is this concern, let's take advantage of it, and then each one do it on their own sphere. The firms, the lead firms on their accumulation spheres, the governments on putting forward their geopolitical interests in the power battle among imperialist states. And if I may, just a very quick, short. You mentioned a very interesting data about the distance traveled by commodities increasing during the. Can you just mention where where is this from? Because I really would like to find the paper or the data about this to keep it for future reference. You just mentioned that after
it was the DHL report, I think.
DHL report. Thank you very much.
Yes, the DHL's recent report. I can send if you can't find it, I can send you the link for it.
Okay. Thank you, Jose, for this interesting question. I think we have Jacopo. Please go, Jacopo.
Okay, thank you so much, Ben. Yes, I have a question because I read carefully your paper in monthly review, and is about the relationship between centralization and concentration. That seems that they go together in the actual capitalism. But you know that there are other authors that argue that supply chain was a way to separate centralization of command and concentration also of workers in the same place. And this is also important related to the question of Andrea, because when we use a Marxist Marx tool as a method of analysis, we always think process in their double phase. So from one side, exploitation, and from the other side, the condition of possibility of emancipation, no? But when we separate concentration and centralization, maybe the result is that it's also a strategy for capital to not produce condition of possibility of this emancipation. So it's, I think, important to understand this process. And how do you think it? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I always like to finish my articles on a positive note with a kind of almost the what is to be done conclusion. But I wasn't able to finish this article with that. I just said it's based on more worker exploitation. So it was quite depressing note, but as a corrective to the mainstream authors, I did that. I think your points are really great. And the idea that, I mean, what you're pointing to, I think, Jacopo, is that innovations under capitalism, they're not just some great outcome of entrepreneurial genius. They're not just about gaining competitive advantage over rival firms. They're also generated by and in response to and attempts to control labor struggles from below. So you can see that many of these AI technologies now are being developed to increase the rate of labor exploitation, to surveil workers in many ways. And so this is a point that Mandel made, I think, as well, that these waves of technological innovations are rooted in waves of worker struggle. So, you know, if we go back to the idea that global value chains emerged, really had their kind of gestation period from the 70s onwards, this was a period of a massive economic crisis and capital's attempts to both reboot profitability and to regain total control over the labor process, because that control had been somewhat compromised in the mass struggles around the world. From Italy, the Bienni Rossi, to here in the 70s, to even in the US, you know. So absolutely, I think your point is very important. Does that mean, though, that capital has found its way? Okay, I'm slightly caricaturing what you're saying, but just pushing it to an extreme way, just to really make the point. Does that mean that capital has found its way to finally control absolutely workers once and for all? No. It does mean that capital has done that to some degree, quite successfully, but it hasn't, because the example of the Amazon in Staten Island, they won an important union recognition agreement, and this is now spreading somewhat. And Ashok Kumar, in his book on monopoly capitalism and global value chains, makes a related point, which I think is very important, which is that with the concentration and centralization, it's not just the lead firms that have concentration and centralization. Of course, lead firms use their power to play suppliers off against each other to reduce any bargaining power suppliers may have to push costs down. But because volumes are increasing, because of the dynamics of competition, you do also have concentration and centralization of supplier firms. And in his book, he gives the example of Yeyuan in China, the huge footwear producer, biggest in the world, I think. And he gives other examples like Fruit of the Loom and Arvind, I think, in India, Fruit of the Loom in Central America. And these are three huge supplier firms that are massively powerful in terms of supplying products to lead firms in core economies. And but the good news is that in these supply firms, you also have concentrations of labor, large concentrations, which are increasingly politically active, increasingly unionized, and have won some victories. So that is where hope kind of starts from, I guess. It may be a low, relatively, it's not what we'd like to see, but that's where hope is, and it's certainly there. So that's a recognition of what you're saying, but also a kind of a corrective in the sense that we can afford to be hopeful, which I think is very important.
Thank you. And I think we have a last question, a final question from Ben. Ben, are you still here with us, or would you like to read the question, please?
Yeah, I can go. Thanks a lot. Yeah, this has been an incredibly interesting session. Yeah, I guess I don't know. I don't want to do a comment rather than a question, but I think I was thinking of this language of resilience, and kind of what immediately came to mind to me, and as perhaps through kind of my lineage, as is this like use of resilience in ecosystem theory, like kind of the work of C.S. Holland, like in the 70s, and that kind of filtering into like the language of sustainability and sustainable development. So I find it quite interesting the kind of the some of the parallels there, kind of going to systems theory, etc. So yeah, you briefly commented on the kind of the climate change aspect. I was just kind of wondering if you had kind of more reflections on the ecological implications, and I don't know if you've kind of thought about that language of resilience as well in terms of the ecosystem, or if that's just kind of, I don't know, a separate lineage or not. But yeah, I'd be very interested for your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. That's a great point. I hadn't thought about it like that in the way you're describing it. And you know, the way sustainability is the key word. You know, everyone uses it, including those of us on the left. So it's kind of hegemonic in so many ways. And you know, maybe some resilient supply chains could be hegemonic. You know, climate smart agriculture talks about resilience of crops and so on to climate breakdown, and also talks about how the climate smart agriculture can contribute to mitigating climate breakdown. In the same way, and this is where I address your points, in the same way that the resilience literature talks about the importance of resilient supply chains, and in the same way that the World Bank and others who promote green upgrading or environmental upgrading within the GVC approach speak about how the GVCs can, I'm paraphrasing here, but not that badly, can save the world or can represent part of the solution. You know, we can have not just economic upgrading, we can have social upgrading, and we can have environmental upgrading. Win, win, win. And that's the way they respond to the problems that their preferred organizational forms of capitalism, that is supply chains, that's where they respond to the problems that organizational system is creating. And they make all this kind of noise about the potential of environmental upgrading. And so I have worked this. I'm working on this now, and what they do is they all suffer from the fallacy of composition. They take an example of one firm that successfully upgrades, and they say, look at that firm. All firms can do it. Just follow their. Don't do exactly what they've done, do it slightly differently, but follow their lead, and we can have generalized upgrading for all, generalized social upgrading for all, generalized green upgrading or environmental upgrading for all. What they never do, and this is kind of ironic given that GVC approach originates in world systems theory, what they never do is take a systemic approach. And what they never do is look at the projections of the size of the world economy, which by 2050, Morgan Stanley estimates will be 3 times that of today. So you can have as much environmental upgrading as you want, but if you're going to have an economy 3 times bigger than today, where are all those resources going to come from? What is the kind of pollution sinks? Where are they going to exist? That kind of systemic impact of increased growth, which upgrading is not just predicated upon, but is designed to accelerate, right? Upgrading is about accelerating the Smithian division of labor, hyper-specialization. It accelerates that kind of growth of the economy. So their whole notion of upgrading is actually part and parcel of the process of climate breakdown, and it's actually exacerbating it. You know, people talk about the was it great transition or the great acceleration starting, I'm not sure exactly when it started, 50s or 60s, something like that. But you know, if you had the great acceleration, then value chain capitalism or hyper specialization has just kind of squared that. It's just exacerbated that to an nth degree. And you can see that again if you look at the World Development Report. They've got this, you know, the odd quote here and there, which they kind of recognize that. They talk about shipping, and you know, you've got all these component parts, and they note the with some, I mean, they write how, you know, one country produces this exports it to country B puts a little bit something else on that exports it to country C. And they note this kind of what hyper specialization means just in terms of transportation. What it means is a massive increase in the pollution load of the shipping production. And they argue that they say that if it's business as usual, it's unsustainable. They use that phrase. So it's funny, you mentioned sustainability and then they say business as usual is unsustainable, but their solution is more business as usual via green upgrading, via more sustainable practices. So, you know, they are as intellectually inconsistent as you would expect, but they can afford to be so because they're operating under this kind of ideological hegemonic system where they can say stuff. I sometimes think that what they write is designed for the kind of Boris Johnson type media interview that you say something and 24 hours later people have forgotten it and they won't really pick you up on it. It's designed for immediate consumption, restatement, and then people forget about it, move on. But when we think about it as academics, we ponder these things and it's like, that's so ridiculous. That's so based on a fallacy of composition, based on environmental destruction. So I would go as far as saying that global value chain, the advocacy of upgrading as a general development strategy, which is what GVC analysis does, is predicated upon an unacknowledged advocacy of ecocide. Because when you look at what it means to produce more and more soy for meat, more and more lithium for you know, the phones and so on, you're talking about ecocide. So I think, but going back to your point about resilience and ecosystem theory, I think that's a really, really good point. And you could do a nice kind of deconstruction of this jargon, this literature, to kind of show where it's coming from, what purposes it's being applied to, and the various fallacies within it. Thanks, Ben. Yeah, it's great point.
Thank you. So, yeah, I think we're done with questions. Thank you very much for the great remarks and points that were raised. I think, you know, it has been a great discussion. Thank you very much, Ben, for joining us. I think, you know, it has been a great talk, which has opened a lot of interesting avenues, which I'm sure will be explored within our consortium. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you again, maybe in person in Sheffield soon. So let's keep in touch. And once again, thank you. I think, you know, everybody has really enjoyed your presentation and the discussion that followed it. So once again, thank you for being with us this afternoon and for the time you have shared with us.
Thanks, Andrea, and thanks to all the discussants and participants. Really great questions. I really like the tone, really constructive kind of engagement. It's very, very nice, very useful. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you, and talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.